You've been disrespected. Maybe it happened this morning. Maybe it happened years ago and you still feel it like a splinter buried just beneath the skin. Someone spoke over you in a meeting. Someone dismissed your opinion. A person you loved looked through you like you weren't even there. Or worse, someone publicly humiliated you and everyone around you saw it happen and said nothing. And you smiled, you nodded, you walked away. And later alone you replayed the moment 100 times. You imagined what you should have said, what you could have done. You felt the heat of it rise in your chest all over again. And maybe you still do. Maybe that's exactly why you're here right now, listening to these words. I want you to stop for a second. I want you to understand something before we go any further. Something the ancient Stoics understood 2,000 years ago. Something that the most powerful men and women in history have known. Something that most people will go their entire lives never learning. The way you respond to disrespect will determine the entire architecture of your life. Not the disrespect itself, not the person who delivered it, not the circumstances around it. Your response. That single moment where you choose, consciously or unconsciously, what the insult means, what it costs you, and what it makes you. Because here's the truth that no one says out loud. Most people don't fail because life is hard. They fail because they never learned how to be disrespected gracefully. They give their power away again and again every time someone is rude to them, dismisses them, or treats them as less than they are. They let those moments hollow them out, one interaction at a time, until there's nothing left but a person who goes through life permanently braced for the next blow. The Stoics had a different idea, a radically different one. They believed, and they built entire lives around this belief, that the human mind, properly trained, can become literally untouchable, that what happens outside of you never has to define what happens inside of you, that disrespect, humiliation, mockery, betrayal, all of it is raw material, fuel, and that a person who masters their response to it becomes not just resilient, but genuinely formidable. Today, I'm going to give you 12 rules, not 10, not 5, 12. Each one drawn from the deep well of Stoic philosophy, from Marcus Aurelius writing by candlelight in a military tent on the Danube frontier, from Epictetus speaking to crowds as a freed slave who had once been tortured, from Seneca writing letters on his deathbed, from Cato walking through Rome in a toga while senators mocked him, from Zeno of Citium standing in the ruins of everything he owned and choosing to rebuild from the inside out. These are not motivational phrases. These are not pretty quotes for your Instagram wall. These are weapons, forged by men who faced genuine persecution, genuine loss, genuine humiliation, and emerged not just intact, but transformed. And I need you to stay with me through all 12 of them, because the first few will make you feel better, the middle ones will make you think differently, but the last few will change you. Before we go into Rule 1, I want to tell you exactly what's going to happen to you if you absorb these 12 principles, not just intellectually, but in your bones. You're going to stop bleeding. That's the first thing. Right now, every time someone disrespects you, it's like a small cut that you don't even notice until you look down and realize you've been losing blood for years. The snide comment from your colleague that you laughed off. The dismissive tone your boss used when you presented your idea. The way someone at a party talked to you like you were furniture. You filed those away. You told yourself it didn't matter. But it did matter. It's all been costing you energy, focus, confidence, and it stops here. The second thing that happens, you become genuinely hard to provoke. Not fake hard, not pretending not to care hard. Actually structurally difficult to destabilize. There's a kind of person you've probably met once or twice in your life. The kind who, when someone tries to get under their skin, just looks at them with calm eyes and says very little. And the person trying to provoke them walks away feeling smaller than they arrived. That becomes you. Third, you start making better decisions. This sounds unrelated, but it isn't. The research is unambiguous. Chronic reactivity, the habit of responding to disrespect with immediate emotional spikes, literally narrows the brain's capacity for rational thought. The prefrontal cortex, the part of you that thinks long-term, that weighs consequences, that sees the full picture, goes offline under emotional flooding. When you master your response to disrespect, you don't just feel calmer, you become smarter, in the most literal neurological sense. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, people begin to treat you differently, not because you've become aggressive, not because you've started fighting back, but because there is something unmistakable about a person who cannot be rattled, something magnetic, something that commands respect without demanding it. You'll notice it. The energy in rooms will shift when you walk in. The way people speak to you will change, because the world, at every level, in every culture, has always known how to recognize a person who has mastered themselves. Rule 1. Understand that disrespect is never about you. In the winter of 177 AD, a Roman senator named Avidius Cassius spread a rumor that the emperor Marcus Aurelius was dead. He declared himself emperor. He marched on Rome with his legions. He did everything short of placing the crown on his own head. Marcus Aurelius was not dead. He heard about the betrayal. He heard about the man who had been his most trusted general, his most admired commander, the man he had personally elevated, choosing public humiliation and treason over loyalty. And Marcus Aurelius did something extraordinary. He wrote in his private journal, the journal we now call the Meditations, which he never intended for anyone else to read, this: "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil." He didn't write rage. He didn't write plans for revenge. He wrote, "These people act this way because they don't know any better." Now let's understand what Marcus was actually doing here, philosophically. He was applying what the Stoics called the doctrine of universal causation, the idea that every action a human being takes is the product of their current understanding, their current fears, their current wounds, their current limitations. When someone disrespects you, they are not revealing something true about you. They are revealing something true about themselves. This is not a soft, comforting idea. This is a hard, mechanical truth. Let me prove it to you. Think about the last time you were genuinely cruel or dismissive to someone. Not your finest moment. Why did you do it? Were you tired? Were you threatened? Were you scared? Were you dealing with something that had nothing to do with that person? Almost certainly, yes. The way you treated them in that moment was a direct projection of your own internal state, your own unprocessed material. It had almost nothing to do with them. The person who disrespected you was doing the exact same thing. There's a story from ancient Athens, documented by Diogenes Laertius, about Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. Zeno had been a wealthy Phoenician merchant. He lost everything in a shipwreck, his entire cargo, his wealth, his livelihood, in a single afternoon. He washed up in Athens with nothing. He walked into a bookshop and picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, the account of Socrates. He read it standing there in the shop. He turned to the bookseller and asked where he could find a man like Socrates. The bookseller pointed to a philosopher named Crates walking down the street. Zeno followed Crates, became his student, and out of the wreckage of his material life built the philosophy that would outlast entire empires. Here is the lesson. When Zeno lost everything, when he had every right to feel humiliated, stripped of wealth, stripped of status, a foreigner in a city where he knew no one, he didn't interpret it as a statement about his worth. He interpreted it as a circumstance, external, neutral. And what he did with that circumstance was entirely his own. The same principle applies to disrespect. When someone looks down on you, dismisses you, mocks you, speaks over you, that is a circumstance. It is external. and how true it actually is about you is a question you get to answer with your own life, not with your words in that moment. The Stoic insight is this: a person who fully understands this, not just intellectually but in their gut, can never truly be insulted. Because the insult always lands somewhere in the gap between what they believe about themselves and what the other person is saying. Close that gap. Know exactly who you are. And suddenly there's nowhere for the insult to stick. Marcus Aurelius knew exactly who he was. He had spent 20 years in daily written self-examination, holding himself to a standard most people would find exhausting. When Cassius betrayed him, it stung. Marcus was human, but it didn't shake his foundation, because his foundation was internal. It was his own character, and no one else's treachery could touch that. The next time someone disrespects you, before you react, ask yourself one question. What must be going on inside this person's life, this person's fears, this person's history, for them to behave this way? You don't have to feel sorry for them. You don't have to forgive them in that moment. Just ask the question, because the moment you ask it, you stop being the target and start being the observer, and observers don't get hurt the way targets do. Rule 2. Master the pause, the most powerful weapon you own. In 65 AD, the Emperor Nero, paranoid, cruel, increasingly unhinged, sent a message to his former tutor Seneca. The message was simple: you are ordered to take your own life. Nero suspected Seneca of conspiracy. The evidence was thin. The accusation was almost certainly false. Seneca received the order. He was 70 years old. He had been one of the most powerful men in Rome. He had written extensively, prolifically, brilliantly about how a Stoic philosopher should face death. And now he was being asked to prove it. What he did not do was panic. He did not beg. He did not attempt to flee. He called his friends together. He spoke calmly to his wife, Pompeia Paulina, who insisted on dying with him. He said to his companions, and these words were recorded by Tacitus, who had sources close to Seneca's household, he said, "What has become of all our philosophy? What has become of the maxims that we have studied for so many years against misfortunes to come?" He paused. He chose his response. And then he opened his veins with complete composure, dictating philosophy to his secretaries as he died. Now, I'm not telling you that handling disrespect requires that level of composure. I'm telling you something more fundamental. The gap between what happens to you and how you respond is where your entire character lives. Seneca knew this better than almost anyone who has ever lived, and the very last demonstration of his philosophy was the ultimate pause. The refusal to let even death make him react without deliberation. For the rest of us, the pause looks different. It looks like this. Your manager publicly criticizes your work in a meeting. Everyone is looking at you. Your face flushes, your jaw tightens, your body floods with cortisol. The instinctive response, to defend yourself, to fight back, to shut down, rises automatically. That's not weakness. That's biology. The amygdala, the alarm system of your brain, fires before your rational mind even knows what's happening. Neuroscientists call this the amygdala hijack. It's real, it's fast, and it makes you do things you regret. The pause is the interrupt, the deliberate insertion of a breath, a count to 3, a single moment of conscious non-reaction between the hijack and your response. Viktor Frankl, who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, put it this way: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies man's freedom and power to choose. In that choice lies his growth and happiness. Frankl wasn't a Stoic by name, but he was describing the most essential Stoic practice, the pause, the pocket of freedom between what happens and what you do about it. Here's what the research shows about why this matters practically. A study from the University of Toronto found that individuals who practiced brief, deliberate pauses before responding in conflict situations were rated as significantly more authoritative, more trustworthy, and more commanding by observers, compared to individuals who responded immediately. The pause didn't make them seem weak or slow. It made them seem powerful. considered, dangerous even in the best sense of the word. Think about every person you've ever genuinely admired when confronted with difficulty. The ones who didn't flinch, the ones who took a beat before they spoke. There's something about that quality, that visible, conscious pause, that signals to everyone around you. This person is not controlled by their circumstances. This person is controlled by themselves. Cato the Younger, one of the last genuine Stoics of the Roman Republic, was famous for this quality. When Julius Caesar was destroying the Republic piece by piece, Cato was the one senator who consistently opposed him. Caesar mocked him in public, tried to have him arrested, attempted to bribe him. Cato's response was always measured, always deliberate. He never ranted, he never raged in the Senate chamber. He spoke quietly, clearly, and devastatingly. Caesar, who feared almost no one, reportedly feared Cato's moral authority more than any general's sword, because Cato never gave Caesar what Caesar was trying to take from him, his composure, his credibility, his self-possession, and without those, no attack, however powerful, could truly land. The next time you are disrespected, do not speak first, breathe first, not theatrically, not as a power move. Actually breathe. Let the first wave of emotion crest and pass, and then, from the clearer water beneath it, choose what you say. That pause is not passivity. It is not weakness. It is the activation of the highest faculty you own, your rational choosing mind. The mind that the Stoics believed was humanity's single greatest gift. Don't waste it on reflexes. Rule 3. Examine yourself first. The courage of honest self-reflection. There's a story about Diogenes the Cynic, who, while not technically a Stoic, profoundly influenced Stoic thought, that has always stayed with me. A man came to Diogenes in a rage, telling him that someone had said terrible things about him. He has called me a fool, an ignorant man, a vain creature. Diogenes listened patiently. Then he said, "And is there any truth in what he said?" The man was furious. He didn't want to examine the criticism. He wanted Diogenes to validate his outrage. But Diogenes, as he always did, cut straight to the only question that actually mattered. The Stoics inherited this relentless commitment to self-examination. Marcus Aurelius writes about it obsessively in the Meditations. He returns to it again and again. This practice of holding himself up to the light and asking, what am I actually doing? What am I actually thinking? Am I acting from virtue or from fear? Am I responding to truth or to my own wounded pride? This practice has a name in the Stoic tradition. It's called prosos, attention, vigilant, unflinching, daily attention to the quality of your own thoughts and actions. The Stoics did not believe you could improve anything you refused to examine, and self-examination to the Stoics was not an act of self-criticism or self-punishment. It was an act of self-care, of genuine respect for your own potential. But let me show you what this looks like in a real historical context, because the theory without the story is just words. Epictetus was born a slave. He was owned by a man named Epaphroditus, who was himself a freedman and secretary to Nero. Epaphroditus, by several accounts, deliberately broke Epictetus's leg as a demonstration of power, possibly to prove a philosophical point about pain, or simply because he could. Epictetus, even as it was happening, reportedly said, "You are going to break it." And when it broke, he said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" There is a reason this story has endured 2,000 years. It's not because Epictetus was some superhuman being who couldn't feel pain. It's because Epictetus had examined himself so thoroughly, so relentlessly, that he knew exactly what was his judgments, his responses, his values, and exactly what wasn't, his body, his circumstances, his freedom. And no one could disrespect what belonged to him, because what belonged to him was inside, where no one else could reach. Now here's the harder application of Rule 3. When someone disrespects you, Before you decide on your response, ask yourself 2 questions. First, is there any grain of truth in this? Not whether the delivery was acceptable, it probably wasn't. Not whether the person had any right to say it, they probably didn't. But is there any actual substance to the criticism? Because if there is, if buried inside the disrespect there is something accurate, then your outrage is misdirected. The Stoics believed that a person who rejects valid criticism because it was delivered rudely is letting their ego cost them their growth. And your growth is worth more than your ego. Always. Second question, did I do anything to contribute to this situation? Not in a self-blaming way, not in a way that lets the other person off the hook. But honestly, was there something in my behavior, my communication, my choices that created conditions for this conflict? If yes, that's information. Valuable information. Information that a less honest person would never access because they were too busy protecting their own story. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder, great-grandfather of Cato the Younger, was famous for a daily self-examination ritual. Every evening before sleep, he would review his day, every conversation, every decision, every interaction where he had fallen short of his own standard. Not to torture himself, to improve. He called it the practice of the examined life, borrowing from Socrates, who had said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Cato, the elder, lived to 90 years old, remained sharp, productive, and morally formidable until his final days. He was relentlessly examined, relentlessly honest with himself, and consequently almost nothing anyone said about him from the outside could damage him, because he had already examined it from the inside. After any incident of disrespect, before you dismiss it entirely or fully absorb it, spend 5 minutes with the Stoic mirror. Not to decide whether you deserved the disrespect. No one deserves disrespect. But to extract whatever small piece of truth or information might be buried in it. That extraction is your gain, and leaving the rest, the rudeness, the malice, the ignorance, behind. Rule 4. Control what is yours. The Stoic dichotomy that changes everything. If there is one idea in all of Stoic philosophy that has saved more lives, more careers, more marriages, more sanities than any other, it is this one. The dichotomy of control. The recognition that everything in the universe can be divided into exactly 2 categories. What is up to you and what is not up to you. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Epictetus, the Enchiridion. This seems simple. It is not. Most people spend the vast majority of their mental and emotional energy on things that are not in their control. The opinion of a colleague, whether their boss recognizes their work, whether their partner appreciates them, whether a stranger on the internet agrees with them, whether someone at a dinner party gives them enough respect. None of these things are in your control, and pouring your energy into them is not just ineffective, it is self-destructive. What is in your control? Your thoughts, your values, your choices, your effort, your character. That's it. That's the whole list. And here's the extraordinary thing. That list, small as it seems, is actually everything that matters. Because every great human achievement in history has come from a person who operated exclusively from that list and let everything else go. Let me tell you about James Stockdale. Admiral James Stockdale was the highest-ranking United States military officer held in the Hanoi Hilton, the North Vietnamese prisoner of war camp, during the Vietnam War. He was shot down in 1965, captured, and spent the next 7.5 years being tortured, isolated, and regularly humiliated by his captors. Stockdale was a student of Epictetus. He had read the Enchiridion at Annapolis, and in that prison he applied it with extraordinary precision. He drew the line. On one side, the torture, the isolation, the humiliation, the uncertainty about whether he would ever see home again. None of this was in his control. On the other side, how he chose to interpret his captivity, how he chose to treat his fellow prisoners, how he chose to maintain his integrity under pressure. All of this was entirely his. Stockdale chose to use his position not to survive quietly, but to organize his fellow prisoners into a coherent unit. He established a communication code tapped on cell walls. He created a structure of resistance. He refused to make propaganda broadcasts, even under torture, because doing so would have been a choice that violated his own values. He accepted the physical consequences. He did not accept the psychological ones. When he was finally released in 1973, he walked off the plane under his own power. He was decorated. He later wrote Courage Under Fire, Testing Epictetus's Doctrines in a Laboratory of Human Behavior, one of the most compelling testimonies to Stoic philosophy ever written. He said quite simply that Epictetus saved his life. Now bring this back to disrespect. The disrespect itself, the words, the tone, the behavior of the other person, is not in your control. It never was. Trying to control it, trying to make the other person take it back, trying to force an apology, trying to change the narrative, trying to make the people who witnessed it see it differently. These efforts, while understandable, are attempts to govern a territory that was never yours to govern. What is yours? Your response, your next action, your interpretation, your decision about what this event means for the future, your choice of whether to address it directly or to let your actions over time speak more eloquently than any confrontation could. Here's the shift that Rule 4 creates. When you internalize the dichotomy of control, you stop being a victim. Victims define themselves by what was done to them, things that were not in their control. Agents define themselves by what they did in response, things that were entirely theirs. The Stoics were always agents, even in chains, even in exile, even on the edge of death. Draw the line, right now. In every situation involving disrespect, before anything else, draw the line. What is mine here? My response, my values, my next move. What is not mine? Everything else. Give all your energy to what's yours. Give nothing to what isn't. Rule 5. See through the performance. Disrespect as weakness in disguise. In the 2nd century BC, there was a general named Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal and effectively ended the Second Punic War, arguably one of the most brilliant military commanders in Roman history. When he returned to Rome after his victories, he was met not with universal admiration, but with political enemies who despised his power and his fame. Cato the Elder, ironically, led the charge against him, using legal accusations, public mockery, allegations of arrogance and financial impropriety. Scipio, who had saved Rome from Hannibal, was being dragged through Roman courts by people who had never set foot on a battlefield. At one point, during a particularly vicious public hearing, Scipio reportedly stopped the proceedings, turned to the crowd and said, "Today is the anniversary of the day I defeated Hannibal. Let us go to the temples and give thanks to the gods." And he walked out, and the crowd followed him. He didn't argue with his attackers. He didn't dignify the accusations with elaborate defenses. He demonstrated with a single action who he was, and implicitly who they were by comparison. He understood something that the Stoics would later articulate explicitly. The person attacking you is usually far less powerful than their attack suggests. This is Rule 5, and it requires a shift in perception that takes practice but, once achieved, is almost impossible to undo. When someone disrespects you, truly disrespects you, not gives you constructive criticism, not challenges your ideas, but actually tries to diminish you, they are performing a very specific psychological function. They are managing their own sense of inadequacy. Full stop. That is the engine of most interpersonal cruelty. Not strength, not confidence, not superiority. Inadequacy, fear, insecurity that has nowhere else to go except outward. The psychologist Alfred Adler whose work deeply influenced modern cognitive therapy, called this the inferiority complex, and he spent his career documenting how most aggressive, domineering, and disrespectful behavior is not an expression of power, but a compensation for its absence. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most secure. The person who most needs to put you down is rarely the person whose opinion should carry any weight. Marcus Aurelius writes in the Meditations about a specific mental exercise. When you're confronted with someone who seems powerful, aggressive, or threatening, try to see them in their private moments, eating, sleeping, worrying about their health, afraid of the dark. Subtract your judgment of them, he writes, and the magnificent spectacle that frightens so many people disappears. This is not about being dismissive, it's about being accurate. The person disrespecting you is not in that moment demonstrating their strength. They are demonstrating their limitation, their inability to engage with you on equal terms, to disagree respectfully, to manage their own frustrations without externalizing them onto you. There's a documented story about Theodore Roosevelt, who was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, particularly the ideas of Marcus Aurelius, from his time as a rancher in the Dakota Badlands in the 1880s. A local bully in a saloon pointed 2 guns at Roosevelt and called him Four Eyes, a reference to his spectacles, and began to mock and intimidate him publicly. Roosevelt, rather than backing down or escalating, studied the man for a moment, and then he hit him 3 times, knocked him out cold. Now, I'm not recommending physical confrontation. The point of the story is Roosevelt's assessment before he acted. He saw through the performance. He recognized that the aggression was theatrical, designed to humiliate without genuine consequence. And he responded not from fear, not from rage, but from an accurate reading of the situation. The bully's display of power was actually a display of the limits of his power. It required an audience, required submission from the target, required the other person to be afraid. Remove those conditions, and the whole performance collapsed. The next time someone disrespects you, instead of feeling smaller, get curious. What is the discomfort, the fear, the inadequacy inside this person that's driving this behavior? You don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to feel superior. Just see it accurately, because accuracy is power, and what you see clearly can no longer frighten you. Rule 6. Cultivate virtue as your armor, living beyond insult. In 399 BC, Socrates was put on trial in Athens. He was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety, essentially teaching people to think for themselves and question received wisdom. He was 70 years old. He had spent his entire life serving Athens in war and in philosophy, and now Athens wanted him dead. His friends arranged for his escape. They had bribed the guards. The ship was ready. All Socrates had to do was leave. He refused. He sat in his prison cell and explained, calmly, patiently, that he could not live in contradiction to his own principles. He had believed all his life in the rule of law, in civic duty, in the integrity of the social contract. To escape would be to become something other than what he was, and what he was mattered more to him than whether he lived. The jury voted to execute him. He drank the hemlock. He died still teaching, still engaging with his friends, still demonstrating the philosophy he had spent his life articulating. The Stoics worshipped Socrates. They saw his death not as a tragedy, but as the ultimate proof of their central thesis, that virtue is its own reward, its own protection, its own justification. That a person who lives in genuine alignment with their values becomes, in the most profound sense, impossible to destroy, because destruction requires that the person lose what matters most to them, and what matters most, their character, their integrity, their inner life, can never be taken away. Seneca writes, "A man's virtue ought not to be measured by his extraordinary exertions, but by his everyday conduct." The armor of virtue is not something you put on for battles, it's something you build day by day, decision by decision, in ordinary moments, so that when the extraordinary moment comes, you're already wearing it. What does this mean practically? It means that the best long-term protection against disrespect is not developing thicker skin. It's developing a clearer conscience, a stronger character, a more consistent alignment between what you believe and how you live. When your behavior is genuinely virtuous, when you are honest, when you follow through on your commitments, when you treat people with dignity, when you do excellent work, when you are the same person in private that you are in public, then the accusations of others simply don't find purchase. There's nowhere for them to grip, because the accusation has to contradict a reality. And if the reality is solid, the accusation slides off. Consider what happened to Abraham Lincoln throughout his presidency. He was called a buffoon, an ape, a country bumpkin, a tyrant, a coward, a saint, a monster, sometimes by the same newspapers in the same week. The disrespect directed at him from all sides was constant, vicious, and creative. And yet Lincoln's response, consistently, was to return to his own standards, to ask not, how do I defend myself, but, am I acting rightly? He kept his compass pointed at his own moral north, not at the criticism swirling around him. Frederick Douglass, who met Lincoln several times, wrote that Lincoln was the first white man he had met who did not make him feel his race in any way. He treated Douglass simply as a man. That quality, that consistent, unpretentious decency in Lincoln was not something that could be eroded by political attack, because it was real, it was daily, it was structural. Audit your life for the gaps between who you claim to be and how you actually behave. Close those gaps, not for the sake of your reputation, for the sake of your armor, because every gap is a place where disrespect can get in, and every closure is a layer of protection that no one else can remove. Rule 7. Practice empathy like a strategist, not a pushover. There is a version of empathy that is weak, the kind that dissolves your own needs in order to accommodate everyone else's, the kind that confuses understanding with agreeing, the kind that leaves you raw and exhausted and no better equipped to navigate the world. And then there is the Stoic version, which is something else entirely. The Stoic practice of empathy begins with a recognition that all human beings share what Marcus Aurelius called a common reason, a fundamental rational nature that connects us. We are made for cooperation, he writes, as feet, as hands, as eyelids, as the rows of the upper and lower teeth. To harm another person is, in some deep sense, to harm yourself. To understand another person is, in the same sense, to know yourself better. But Marcus was also an emperor. He managed armies, administered justice, negotiated with foreign powers. His empathy was not passive. It was strategic. He sought to understand people's motivations, not in order to excuse them, but in order to respond to them more intelligently. This is the Stoic version of empathy. Not, I feel what you feel and therefore I won't hold you accountable. But, I understand what is driving your behavior, which gives me more information than you realize, and allows me to respond in a way that serves my own values rather than simply reacting to your provocation. Let me give you a historical example that illustrates this precisely. In the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, deeply despised Lincoln before he knew him. He referred to Lincoln as a guerrilla, mocked his appearance and intellect publicly, and treated him with open contempt. Lincoln was fully aware of this. Rather than retaliating or excluding Stanton from power, Lincoln studied the man. He understood that Stanton's arrogance came from genuine competence. He was brilliant at military administration. He understood that Stanton's harshness came from a deep sense of duty and impatience with anything he perceived as incompetence. Lincoln used this understanding to engage with Stanton on Stanton's own terms, to show him gradually that Lincoln's apparent simplicity was actually strategic depth. By the end of the Civil War, Stanton revered Lincoln. He was at Lincoln's bedside when he died, and it was Stanton who said, upon Lincoln's death, those famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The man who had once called Lincoln a gorilla. Lincoln's empathy was not weakness. It was intelligence deployed as relationship management. He understood Stanton accurately, which was a form of respect for Stanton's reality, and used that understanding to transform an enemy into an ally. Now, here's how this applies to disrespect. When someone disrespects you and you take the time to genuinely understand what might be driving their behavior, what fear, what wound, what competitive anxiety, what cultural conditioning, you do two things simultaneously. First, you stop personalizing their behavior, which immediately reduces your emotional reaction. Second, you gain strategic intelligence about how to respond in a way that might actually change the dynamic, rather than simply feeding the conflict. Stoic empathy is not about being nice, it's about being effective. It's about seeing clearly enough to respond wisely rather than reacting blindly. It keeps you in your prefrontal cortex, your rational brain, rather than letting the amygdala run the show. It makes you smarter, not softer, more capable, not more vulnerable. When you encounter disrespect, spend 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, imagining what the world looks like from inside that person's mind. Not to excuse them, not to absorb their behavior, but to understand it well enough to respond from a position of clarity rather than chaos. That 30 seconds of genuine understanding is worth more than an hour of rehearsed comebacks. Rule 8. Set boundaries from strength, not anger. There's a dangerous misreading of Stoicism that I need to address directly, because if you take it away from this video, it will undo everything else. The misreading goes like this. Stoicism teaches acceptance. Therefore, a Stoic accepts everything that is done to them without protest. This is completely wrong. It is historically, philosophically, and practically wrong, and I need to show you exactly why. Cato the Younger, arguably the most pure Stoic of the Roman Republican era, did not silently accept what he regarded as the corruption of his world. He fought. He spoke in the Senate for hours on end to prevent Caesar from assuming power. He refused to accept Caesar's pardon when it was offered, because to accept it would have been to legitimize Caesar's authority over him. He opposed, clearly and consistently, what he believed to be wrong. The fact that he lost did not make him a poor Stoic. It made him the Stoic. Epictetus, who had been enslaved, who had been tortured, did not teach his students to accept mistreatment without response. He taught them to respond from their values rather than from their wounds. That's a very different instruction. The Stoic approach to boundaries is this. You draw them clearly and calmly from a place of self-knowledge rather than emotional reaction. The difference between a boundary set from anger and a boundary set from strength is enormous, both in how it feels for you and in how it lands for the other person. A boundary set from anger says, "You've hurt me, and I'm making this about my pain." It is reactive. It is centered on the other person's behavior. It requires their response to validate it. And because it comes from a place of emotional flooding, it is often imprecise, excessive, and easily dismissed. A boundary set from strength says, "This is who I am and how I expect to be treated. I am telling you this calmly because I am confident in it. I don't need you to agree. I don't need you to apologize. I simply need you to understand where I stand." This kind of boundary is precise. It is rooted in self-respect rather than self-defense. And it is, paradoxically, much harder to argue with or dismiss. Consider how Nelson Mandela set boundaries during his 27 years of imprisonment on Robben Island. He refused to wear shorts, the prison uniform assigned to black prisoners as a further humiliation, while white prisoners wore long trousers. He refused for 2 years. He was punished for it. He continued to refuse. Eventually, the prison gave all prisoners long trousers. His boundary was not set from rage. It was set from absolute clarity about his own dignity. He communicated it without drama, and he maintained it without exception. The guards on Robben Island, by most accounts, were split. Some treated Mandela with respect almost from the beginning. Others began as adversaries and ended as something close to friends. Mandela was consistent with all of them. The same dignity, the same courtesy, the same absolute refusal to be dehumanized. His boundaries were not a wall keeping people out. They were a standard that people eventually rose to meet. This is the distinction between a rock and a wall. A wall is built to keep people out. It's reactive, defensive, a response to fear. A rock simply is what it is. It doesn't need to defend itself. It doesn't change its shape based on what's pushing against it. And over time, it shapes everything around it, rather than being shaped. Identify your non-negotiables, the specific ways of being treated that you will not accept. Write them down if it helps, and when those lines are crossed, address them, once, clearly, calmly, without drama, without apology. That's not how I'll be spoken to. Let's continue this conversation differently, and then hold the line. Not from stubbornness, from knowing who you are. Rule 9. Use humor as a scalpel, the philosopher's lightest weapon. Seneca wrote something that surprises people when they first encounter it in the middle of his deeply serious philosophical letters. It is better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. He had a dry, quiet wit that runs through his letters like a vein of gold in stone, and he used it not to deflect serious things, but to see them from a different angle, to break the spell of self-importance that can make suffering feel permanent and overwhelming. There is a specific kind of humor that the Stoics valued, not the humor that mocks, not the humor that diminishes others, not the humor that signals superiority, but the humor that signals perspective. The quiet, genuine amusement of a person who can see the absurdity in any situation, including the situations in which they themselves are made to look foolish. This kind of humor is disarming in the most literal sense. It removes the weapon from the other person's hand without them realizing it's gone. Let me give you one of the most brilliant documented examples of this in history. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln, then a lawyer and political candidate, was publicly mocked by his debate opponent Stephen Douglas for being two-faced. Douglas said it loudly, in front of an audience, intending to humiliate Lincoln by playing on his somewhat unusual appearance. Lincoln's response was immediate and devastatingly effective. He said, "I leave it to my audience. If I had another face, do you think I would wear this one?" The audience erupted. Douglas had no follow-up. The attack was neutralized before it could land. What Lincoln did in that moment was not deflection. It was something much more sophisticated. He took the insult, owned it, redirected it, and in doing so demonstrated that it had no power over him. The joke only works if you're not wounded by what it's joking about. His ease with his own appearance signaled to the audience, this man cannot be rattled, and a man who cannot be rattled is a man who cannot be controlled. Winston Churchill was perhaps the great modern master of this Stoic technique. Lady Astor once told him, "If you were my husband, I'd put poison in your tea." Churchill replied without missing a beat, "If you were my wife, I'd drink it." His ability to meet personal attack with wit rather than anger consistently made his attackers look small and him look large, regardless of the merit of the underlying argument. The Stoics saw laughter as a form of perspective, the audible recognition that what is happening is not the whole of reality, not the permanent definition of things, not a catastrophe, but a scene in a long play. Marcus Aurelius writes about viewing human affairs from a great height, imagining them as small and temporary against the